We talk a lot about longevity in modern medicine, living longer, extending lifespan, chasing the next breakthrough. But here's the uncomfortable truth, okay? Most people aren't worried about living to 95. They're worried about how they'll feel at 65. They're worried about losing strength, losing energy, losing independence, and that's why today's conversation isn't about adding years to your life. It's about delaying decline, right? Because longevity isn't about the number of candles on your cake. It's about how capable you are when you blow those things out. So, welcome back to the Longevity Game podcast. I am Michael Ward. I'm a longtime ICU nurse practitioner, founder and CEO of the Longevity and Performance Clinic franchise called Next Level TRT. And I'm someone deeply invested in helping people not just live longer, but live better. Welcome, welcome, and welcome. All right, all right. What's up, everybody? So, this podcast exists for people who want to understand what's really happening inside their body without the hype, without shortcuts, and without being rushed through a 7-minute appointment. My God, I hate those. I hate those. Today is an episode. It's one that I think about often in my clinic because I hear versions of this every single week, and it's like, it sounds like this. I just don't feel like myself anymore, you know? And, these people, they're not sick, they're not broken, they're just declining, And so that's what we're going to unpack today. What decline actually is, why it starts earlier than most people realize, and what you can do right now to slow it down, And so that is what we are going to get in today. All right. So let's hear it. So when people hear the word aging, when you hear the word aging, what do you picture? Do you picture just wrinkles and gray hair? I mean, the first thing that pops into my mind, I think aging, I think wrinkles and gray hair. But decline doesn't start on your face. It starts quietly, right? In your muscle tissue. It starts in your mitochondria, in your hormones, in your metabolic flexibility. Those things, that's where it starts. Decline is losing strength before you lose the years. It's slow recovery, worse sleep, and brain fog. It's also like fat gain, right? It doesn't respond like it used to, or just all of a sudden you start getting fat and you're not really doing much anything different than you were before, right? And clinically, what we're really talking about is a loss of something called physiologic reserve. This is your body's ability to adapt. And here's the most important part that people don't realize. Decline often begins in your 30s or your 40s, long before anyone would consider you old. Well, maybe except for your kids, right? So and I know my kids call me old man all the time, but, muscle mass declines, VO2 max declines, insulin sensitivity declines, hormones slowly drift downward, and none of this happens overnight. It really just happens quietly until one day you wake up and you realize, my gosh, my body is no longer responding the way that it used to, you know? And longevity medicine at its best is about intervening early, not rescuing late. That's the illness paradigm, right? The wellness paradigm is prevention. You got to work on it intentionally, proactively, and so not rescuing, not dealing with things once they have happened, putting band-aids on things. Because once you've lost your health, it's hard to get it back, at least 100%, you know? And so, in the ICU, I've worked lots of years in the ICU and in the emergency rooms, and people do not intentionally or proactively do the things that are going to push off aging or slow decline. Most people don't. And in the ICU, my gosh, I've coded so many. I would say thousands over the years that I've been in the ICU and in the emergency room. And these people are at the end of their life, they're in the last few decades of their life, if not the last, and they would give anything to just go back and change some choices, to go back to the position that you're in right now. You are right in a place right now where you can make some big changes, or at least move in the direction where that decline is held off, is thwarted, and you have longer quality of life, right? And so that's what this is about. If longevity isn't about living longer, but about delaying the decline, The real question is, what should you be doing, right? How do you stave off the decline that comes with aging? All right. So today, what we're going to talk about are four things, the top four things I think that you should be doing right now to delay the decline that inevitably comes with aging, especially if you're not proactively pursuing, these things, these four things. And so let's get into that. Let's get into that. The first one, and this is I've made them numerically important. They're important in order. They're numbered in order of importance. And so I want to say preserve muscle at all costs. My gosh, if you could do one thing out of these four, this one is going to equate to higher quality of life, longer. Okay, and so let's talk about that. Preserve muscle at all costs. And I'll take it another step a little further would be build muscle starting today. It doesn't get easier. Muscle isn't cosmetic, right? Muscle is not, it's just aesthetic alone, right? It looks good. It looks good to be pumped, right? It looks good, to have some muscle mass. When you walk in a room, people notice, that's cool. But that's not the key. That's not the biggest thing. That shouldn't be your biggest motivation to build muscle, right? Building muscle is like metabolic armor, right? It protects against insulin resistance, frailty, falls, and loss of independence entirely. After the age of 30, most adults lose muscle every single year unless they actively fight to keep it. And what's really scary is that, like, after your 40s, you lose up to 30% of your muscle mass per decade. That is a lot, especially when you compound that over decades, you know? And let me tell you, those years later, do you think it's easier or harder later on in life to build muscle? It's absolutely harder. It's absolutely harder. I often tell people, let's do a little mind experiment. You're working right now, but one day you're going to be retired. And when you retire, how do you picture life? Like, what do you want to be doing during retirement? Do you think about all those really, really fun things that you're going to be doing? Now that you don't have to go to work anymore, you have a little retirement, little nest egg stacked away. How are you going to, what are you going to be doing? Think about all those adventurous things that you wanted to do once you finally were able to retire. Let me tell you, if you don't have any muscle or if you don't have any strength, it's going to be tough. It's going to be really, really tough to do those fun things. And so you gotta do it. You gotta start today. Friends, resistance training isn't optional. Adequate protein isn't optional. Hormonal health isn't optional. If your longevity plan doesn't include preserving muscle mass, I promise you, it's an incomplete plan. All right. And look, I get it. It's tough to make time to go to the gym and lift weights. And I have to say, every day that I get up, it gets harder and harder. It doesn't get easier and easier with time, right? But, I keep telling myself the things that I tell my patients, like, you got to think about the future. Like, how do you want to feel in your 60s? How do you want to feel in your 70s? How do you want to feel in your 80s? If you live to be 90 or 100, if only half of your body's working, is it really worth it? You know? I'd rather go early. My only half of my body works and I'm having to have somebody clean up after me. If I'm living in a nursing home and it's lonely because my family doesn't come and visit me or any of that stuff, I think about that and I'm like, man, I don't want that. I want to be agile. I want to be mobile. I want to be strong. I want to do all those fun things that I picture myself doing after retirement. And so, it's tough. It's tough to go to the gym and lift heavy things, especially if you're not used to it, right? Or you've never done it, But you know what else is tough? I'll tell you what else is tough. Having to face the fact that you're going to have to walk with a cane or a walker for the rest of your life. What's tough is to give up your independence because you can no longer take care of yourself. You can't even drive yourself anymore. Right? Just have to sell your house and go live in a nursing home because you don't have the functional strength, or the physiologic reserve to care for yourself anymore, ever again. That's it. It's all downhill from there, guys. So trust me, friends, it is worth it. And it doesn't have to be brutal. You don't have to completely brutalize yourself every day when you go into the gym, you know? There is a way that you can slowly start integrating weight resistance training in your life and then slowly increasing that intensity as your body allows it to. 2 days in the gym is better than no days in the gym. You know what I mean? And so if I know it sounds like I'm trying to sell you on working out. Well, I am. That's what I'm trying to do. Okay. Next, let's see. Next, we're going to talk about mitochondrial health. We want to protect mitochondrial health. You know, if preserving or building muscle is first, mitochondrial health is definitely a very, very close second. What's crazy is like nobody's really talking about mitochondrial health. You know, it's like a completely foreign concept to so many people, most people really. So let's back it up a little bit and let's first talk about what mitochondria are. Right. So mitochondria, you guys remember when we were in science class a long, long time ago, you know, and there was that picture of the cell and it was like a cell and you could see inside it and there was like a section that was pulled out of the cell. Do you remember that? I think every science class in the nation probably had that poster on the wall, or it was at least definitely in your science book, right? And there was, you know, you had the nucleus, you know, you had the endoplasmic reticulum, the Golgi apparatus, you know, you had all those little organelles in there. And then you had the mitochondria, which was there's like two or three of them, you know, in the cell, which isn't really a good representation, you know, because there's hundreds, sometimes even thousands or more mitochondria in a cell, depending on where that cell is, you know. Like in your heart cells probably have thousands and thousands of mitochondria within each cell because it needs ATP, which brings me to this. Mitochondria produce your body's cellular energy currency, ATP. You may remember that, adenosine triphosphate, right? And as you age, mitochondrial efficiency or your ability for the mitochondria to do their job declines. And it begins to decline pretty rapidly the older you get. And so once it starts to decline, then you start having this low grade inflammation. This is where the effects of aging really, really start to heat up. You know, so you have all this. When the mitochondria start to become inefficient, you start cranking out reactive oxygen species, and it causes low grade inflammation, right? And it just keeps getting worse, and it starts showing up visibly, not just metabolically, but visibly. And, you know, it's just bad. And so when they decline, everything declines. Energy, recovery, you know, cognition, like all that stuff. You have to have energy just for your cells to be able to do the things that they do. And so this is also where aerobic capacity matters, you know, like walking, you know, zone-based cardio, like zone 2 cardio. We've talked about that a lot here. Zone 2 cardio, this actually improves mitochondrial density and fat oxidation. And so if you'll do like 30 to 60 minutes of zone 2 cardiovascular exercise, like 2 to 4 times a week, you know, you can see some benefit. Also, occasionally you want to push, you know, light it up a little bit higher, you know, you want to push that intensity a little further and just a couple times a week, right? And this triggers mitochondrial biogenesis. The harder you work, the more your mitochondria are going to be. Biogenesis means making new mitochondria, right? And so when you do like HIIT training, high intensity interval training, just 1 or 2 times a week, it causes mitochondrial biogenesis. So new mitochondria come on the scene, and that's good. Also, VO2 max, it's probably one of the strongest predictors of all cause mortality we have. The higher your VO2 max, the less risk you have of death from any disease or non-disease. So checking VO2 max and keeping, you know, your VO2 max up, that's good. That's really good. You know, mitochondria adapt when it's exposed to mild controlled stress. You know, things like intermittent fasting, also known as time restricted feeding. You know, whenever you intermittent fast, this encourages mitophagy. And this goes back to these mitochondria that just aren't doing very much. Your body kind of starts scavenging for bad mitochondria and then it just gets rid of them, you know, and then you start making more mitochondria to replace the bad ones, you know. So this is called mitochondrial recycling. And that's good. That's good. So whenever you do intermittent fasting, that happens. You can see that. Also, cold exposure, which I personally hate. You know, you guys, I know you've heard of like cryotherapy, and you have these cold plunge tubs, I have to be honest with you guys. Like, I can barely get in a cold shower or a lukewarm shower, you know what I mean? Like, I can barely get in a swimming pool when it's just not up to, warming up, I mean, this cold plunging stuff, I just can't get into it. I can't get into it. I wish I could. I see people do it. They get down, they just jump in there and sit down, and you can tell they're torturing themselves. They're like, their bottom lips start to quiver, a little bit. And I can only imagine how terrible it is. So although this is really, really great, it does a couple things, it increases mitochondrial efficiency and it increases brown fat activity, which is the bad fat, but I just can't get into it, But if that's something that you can tolerate, then it's not a bad idea, to help boost mitochondrial efficiency. The next thing you can do on the flip side, which I'm very, very happy and inclined to do, is heat therapy or heat exposure. Think about saunas, right? Saunas activate heat shock proteins and support mitochondrial resilience, and so that's awesome. Think intentional stress, right? Followed by recovery, you know, and I can do a sauna 5 days a week. I love it. I love it. Also, there's things that we can do nutritionally. Nutrition that supports mitochondria, includes stuff like adequate protein. You got to have it. You got to have the protein, you know? And that doesn't mean you have to bolus a whole bunch of protein at the end of the day, right? That's not how it works. You got to have protein throughout the day, right? And this supports mitochondrial enzymes, and healthy fats like omega 3s, they can support mitochondrial membranes, right? And then micronutrients like magnesium, iron, B vitamins, these are critical, Other nutrients that you can, I mean, I'm not saying you got to take all this stuff, but in, small little compounds like CoQ10 that helps with energy production, alpha lipoic acid or ALA, you may have heard of it, ALA, and L-carnitine, or even like green tea. By the way, all of those things that I just mentioned actually have been shown to increase fat loss as well. If you're trying to diet, those things, the CoQ10, the ALA, the L-carnitine, the green tea, all those things help to boost fat loss. Also, it's pretty cool. And polyphenols like berries and stuff like that. Also, you want to avoid some things. All right. You want to avoid ultra processed foods and excess sugar. I don't think I have to really say that. Most people know, right? But ultra processed foods are terrible for your body. And then that excess sugar is no good. Damages mitochondrial signaling. It causes inflammation. It's just not good, And lastly, sleep and recovery. This is one that I've really been trying to dial in. And I use an Aura ring that really helps me to track my sleep. A lot of people come to me in the clinic and they're saying, I'm so tired all the time. And I'll say, so how are you sleeping well? And they're like, yeah, I get 8 hours. Well, that doesn't really mean you're sleeping 8 hours. And let me give you, for instance, on my Aura ring the other night, I was like 2 nights ago, my wife and I, we went out. We had a great time. Probably went out a little too late. We probably had too much of a good time. We got home. It was like 3 in the morning. And then we slept till like 10, right? That's 7 hours. I couldn't sleep past 10. I tried. I looked at my sleep data, and it said that I was in the bed for roughly about 7 hours, but I only slept for 5 hours and 29 minutes. And so I would have assumed that I slept 7 hours, but that's not the case. I only slept 5 hours and 29 minutes, and my resilience score and my sleep score was terrible, like 50. I tossed and turned, and it told me how much I moved, and it told me how terrible my sleep was. I got no deep sleep, and I got very little REM sleep. And I felt awful the next day. So you may think you're sleeping as much as you think you're sleeping, but you might not be. And so it's really cool to have a wearable that'll allow you to track your sleep, you know, and that can really give you some insight in how you're feeling on a day to day basis too. You need to try to get between 7 and 9 hours of sleep. And also, that amount of sleep can support mitochondria repair. Also, when you wake up, morning sunlight's great for circadian signaling or circadian priming. I use something in the morning if I find myself getting up pretty early, and it's a very high powered light. It's 10,000 lumens. I can show you. I got it right here. It's called a Verilux, but it's a 10,000 lumen light. This sucker is so bright. but it causes circadian priming when you wake up. And it just kind of just zaps all the melatonin. It helps to reset your circadian rhythm. And you do it for about 10 to 15 minutes, So I'll do that while I'm doing some work here at the desk. And so also you want to limit blue light at night. And that helps to protect melatonin, which also acts, by the way, as a mitochondria antioxidant, you know? So poor sleep equals inefficient energy production, right? And the last thing, reduce mitochondrial toxins. And the way you can do this is like if you smoke, stop smoking, or also limit excessive alcohol intake. And if I were to add one more thing, I would say psychological stress. My gosh, it can really do a number on mitochondrial health. It can do a number on you. Stress will kill you. It causes high levels of inflammation, and it'll kill you. You'll have a heart attacks from how stressed you are, and that is no joke, right? So you need to practice, something like maybe journaling or mindful meditation or some type of relaxation techniques just a few times during the day if you have a very high stressful life, and also, of course, avoid any environmental toxins. All right. Anyway, you don't need to be an endurance athlete. I get that, but you do need to stay metabolically capable, and this is why maintaining mitochondrial health or mitochondrial efficiency is important to longevity. All right. I personally take some peptides for that. And these are two peptides that I always have. And it's SS31 and MOTS-C. And I've talked about SS31 and MOTS-C both here on previous episodes. SS31 helps to strengthen the structural integrity of the mitochondria. It binds to cardiolipin, which maintains the structural matrix of mitochondria, and it helps to strengthen your mitochondria. The other peptide, which I take, like I said, is MOTS-C. And if you want to hear more about that one, it just boosts mitochondrial efficiency like crazy. It opens up the AMPK longevity pathway. It helps with metabolism. I mean, it's a really great peptide. And it's the one I always keep. Like, again, I've talked about both of these at length. So I think it was on episode 12. It may have been episode 13. Check it out. All right. And number 3, you want to control inflammation and insulin resistance. Chronic inflammation and poor metabolic health accelerate aging faster than almost anything else. Like I said, poor sleep equals poor recovery. All right. If you have excess visceral fat, this is the type of fat that it's highly inflammatory and it drives insulin resistance, right? And it causes constant, up and down blood sugar spikes, right? Which is not good. These silently damage blood vessels and nerves and your organs, really. And those are things that you've got to nail down. Longevity doesn't come from extremes, right? It comes from consistency. Consistent sleep, consistency with nutrition, consistency with movement, and consistency with body composition. Lastly, number 4, you want to use tools strategically, not emotionally. All right. What does I mean by that? Well, this is where hormones, peptides, and supplements fit in. All right. They're tools. They're not magic. All right. When used appropriately, they can really help restore function, speed recovery, and they can improve your quality of life. All right. But when you use them recklessly, they can do the opposite. All right. And then they can distract you from the fundamentals, which was what you really need to be focused on. These are like cherries on top, right? So the key is intention, dosing, duration, and then having somebody to help you with that, guide you through that, like medical, clinical oversight. We're not talking about buying stuff online that you shouldn't be buying online and then just winging it. Which, by the way, this brings us to our weekly peptide spotlight. All right. Today, we're going to talk about the peptide BPC-156. If you don't know, every week we have a peptide spotlight. I have prescribed peptides all the time in the clinic. And I have so many people that they don't know, a lot about peptides. And then there's a lot of people out there that talk about peptides that probably shouldn't be talking about peptides because there's so much bro talk out there in the social universe, right? And a lot of bro science that doesn't really hold up when you put it against clinical scrutiny and all the studies out there for each thing, Sounds good. Some people can really talk the talk, but some of the stuff they say, I listen, I'm like, good Lord. And so we're going to talk about that. Spotlight on BPC-157. BPC-157, to help you remember this, because, peptide names aren't sexy, right? BPC-157. It's hard to remember. So BPC stands for Body Protective Compound 157. And I get asked about this peptide quite often, especially when it comes to injuries, joint pain, tendon issues, and gut health. Right? Those are the big drivers of people's questions for BPC 157. So this peptide is in the conversation a lot also, and it is as a buzz, in fitness circles. Right. So I wanted to talk about that one today. So it's a synthetic fragment of a peptide that's originally discovered in the gastric juices of our stomach. Right. We actually make this in our body, but we don't make it in sufficient enough quantities to do the really amazing things that we see clinically when it's taken. It's known for supporting tissue repair. It can really heal things up quick. It's pretty amazing. Also, it promotes angiogenesis, which is blood vessel formation. It reduces inflammation and it can support gut integrity. I've used the encapsulated version, BPC 157, to help people with inflammatory bowel issues and have seen some pretty great results. All right. Clinically, though, people are more interested in it for like I said, the tendons, the ligaments, the muscles, and the joints, which is great because it works. Like if you've all but given up and you have these nagging aches and pains, or maybe you had surgery and you're just not healing quickly, BPC 157 is not a bad idea. All right. There is some stuff out there that I've been seeing a lot lately, though. A lot of rhetoric, a lot of talk about how it causes cancer, right? If you take it for too long. Now, I want to address this, all right? Can BPC cause cancer? This, I think, comes from a misunderstanding. I can understand why people would think that BPC may cause cancer, and I think it's because BPC 157 supports healing and blood vessel formation, right? People assume that means it could feed cancer, right? And here's what we actually know. There's no evidence at all that BPC 157 causes cancer. We have nothing in the clinical literature that shows that BPC 157. There's no human data showing an increased cancer risk with BPC 157. Unless it was just published yesterday, I have not heard or seen anything that shows that BPC 157 causes cancer. Most data that we have comes from animal and cellular models when we're talking about BPC 157. We don't have any long-term human safety trials with BPC 157, but in the models that we've seen, we have not seen it cause cancer. All right. And so when people say BPC might cause cancer, ham was just noted to be a carcinogen, right? Like sandwich meat ham, but people are eating ham all the time. There's no literature that shows BPC 157 causes cancer, and people are worried about it. It's crazy. People just kind of latch on to things that they hear that sound right, and then they just go with it. And then they tell somebody else, and it's like that old game that we used to play in school. What is it, like Telegram, or like where you tell somebody something in their ear, and by the time it comes back around, it's not even remotely close to what you had said the first time. And so that's kind of like that. Supporting healing is not the same as promoting cancer. The body repairs tissue every single day, right? And we do build blood vessels every single day. We're not getting cancer every day, right? Context matters. Dose, duration, patient history, that matters. If you have a very strong history of cancer, maybe it's not a good idea to get on BPC 157. But we don't have any literature that would advise against that because in regard to cancer. Again, I just want to just clear that up, right, for the record. But this is why these compounds should be used thoughtfully and under medical guidance, not casually or indefinitely, like forever, man. People buy these things online, and they just kind of wing it. Then they're buying it from places that, I mean, it baffles me, right? Okay, let's just say I'm going to go buy a prescription medication, a peptide, from an online source that says on the label, not for human consumption. Or it's going to say something like, for research purposes only, right? But then again, I'm going to turn around and be worried because this guy says that BPC 157 may cause cancer. Well, I would be more worried about buying a prescription medication from some of these underground online websites that say not for human consumption, and then you're going to inject it in yourself anyway. I don't understand the rationale. But anyway, short term, you want to use BPC 156 for specific injuries, right? With clear goals, not as a chronic indefinite therapy. It's a tool, not a lifestyle. All right. If you want to know what the dosing is that most people use for BPC, it is 500 micrograms up to 1,000 micrograms per day. And you can use it 7 days a week, you know, and again, for a goal, for a purpose. If you haven't seen any results after 2 months, the stuff you're getting probably isn't working. It doesn't, I'm telling you, BPC 157, whenever it is the real thing from an actual pharmacy, which is where I prescribe it to, you're going to get the real thing and you're going to see results. Anyway, if you're not seeing results after 2 to 3 months, you're probably not getting the real BPC 157. So, anyway, clinical takeaways, guys. Let's talk about this for just a couple minutes. If you take nothing else from today's episode, remember this: decline is not inevitable, but ignoring it is a choice. Longevity medicine isn't about living forever. It's about staying capable. It's about staying independent and engaged for as long as possible. Also, muscle matters. Mitochondria matter. Metabolic health matters. And tools like peptides, they matter, but they should be used with intention and not hype, right? And so that is it. The end of today's episode. We're pushing 35 minutes. If this episode was helpful, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Also, follow the podcast. You don't miss future episodes. We release new episodes, new conversations about every week. And if you have questions or topics you'd like for us to cover, let us know. This podcast exists to educate, not sell. I'll see you on the next episode of the Longevity Game podcast. Thank you for joining me today. Stay intentional, stay informed, and as always, go long. If you have questions, business inquiries, you'd like to sponsor an episode, or if you'd like to be a guest on the show, just send us an email at hello@thelongevitygamepodcast.com. If you're interested in being a guest on the show, hit us up at beaguest@thelongevitygamepodcast.com. If you're interested in supporting or sponsoring the show, hit us up at sponsors@thelongevitygamepodcast.com. And my friends, that is it. I hope you guys have a great week. I am out.